Nick, what happened to the Philadelphia 76ers last night?
Well, give the Raptors credit. We had talked up to this point in the series. It had been Kawhi doing his job and his teammates not helping him out. Last night was the first night of this series where Kawhi was actually somewhat inefficient, where Kawhi was fine but not great, but his teammates were exceptional.
Finally.
I mean, the numbers on that, not to throw numbers at you immediately, but the numbers on that speak for themselves as far as games 1 through 4, what Kawhi was doing compared to what his teammates were doing. And then in Game 5, I mean, in Game 5, his teammates accounted for 104 points. They'd been averaging 60. His percentages were down almost 20%, but they were able to, like Jenna said, lead by 40 at one point. So the other Raptors did their job. The other Raptors looked like the team that was 17-5 during the season in the 22 games Kawhi missed. But unfortunately, the bigger story is not, at least in my eyes, about the winners in Toronto. It's about the losing team in Philadelphia that was just dominated from the end of the first quarter to the end of the game. This game, we had a ball game. To be down by 40 in a game that's a one-point game at the end of the first quarter means those final 3 quarters, you just got obliterated. And see, they got obliterated in a game where Jimmy Butler stepped up. Tobias Harris had a decent game. But the 2 key pieces of the process, Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, for the second straight game did not show up. The second game in a row where they had a chance to take either a 3-1 or a 3-2 series lead. They're 2 crown jewels of that era of tanking. The number 3 pick, Joel Embiid, the number 1 pick, Ben Simmons, were really bad in Games 4 and then again in Game 5, and that's why their season's on the brink in a couple days.
Yeah, I don't want to overreact because the Sixers had plenty of opportunities. And opportunities just not in game number 5, goes back to game number 4. Joel Embiid has a point-blank range layup, opportunity for Philly to take the lead late in the game. Because if that shot goes in, it's a different story.
In Game 4.
In game number 4.
3-1 going into Game 5.
Yes, then you have an opportunity to have a bad game. Joel Embiid has been battling his health, but it didn't go in. So they didn't have any margin. And to think that, Nick, you had pointed out, like how important game number 5s were with the series tied 2-2. The team that wins that series is winning.
The team that wins that game is in just a gigantic position of strength historically. We've seen teams come back from 3-2. It's not like coming back from 3-1. But
they are winning 80% of the series,
absolutely
though,
right? You're winning just over 80% of the time if you win Game 5 in a tied series.
So for me, the biggest indictment, knowing the coaches have told the players that, how important the game is, how flat just the team was. Now, they came out with an initial burst and everything, and I'm not going to make an excuse for Joel Embiid and his health. Because as a superstar player, we have seen other superstar players under great duress being, deaths in the family to sicknesses. If you're on the court, as my man Shaq said last night, you should be accounted for, and you're not making any excuses. So Joel should be able to do other things to be able to affect the game. But when you don't have your star players, the most critical game of the season, show up, and the other players around them, you don't have any excuses. The 76ers, this was their year. They were trying to go for it. And you talked about LeBron moving to the West, the teams in the East. You wanted to be in a position that when LeBron left, or if LeBron got injured, that you were ready to capitalize, and that's what they did. Elton Brand, as the general manager,
pressed play on this thing. They could have taken the long view. They trade future picks for Jimmy Butler. They doubled down on that. They trade 2 first-rounders for Tobias Harris. They go all in on this moment, seeing the weakness in Boston, seeing that maybe Milwaukee doesn't have the experience. You don't know what Toronto and Kawhi are going to look like in the playoffs. They said, this can be our moment. This can be our year. And while Boston is catching a ton of heat for how disappointing it's going to be that their season ends in the second round, a close second on disappointment would be the Philadelphia 76ers if their season ends in the second round.
That's why you can't predict how a team will be based on what it looks like on paper. It's the same thing we say with the Cleveland Browns. On paper, they have a great starting 5 and everything should work great, and they somehow couldn't find a way to make this team work. But when Toronto's bench is playing like it did, when they can, I think they had 32 points off the bench when he's only giving you 21, Kawhi Leonard, and they're able to dominate like that. How unstoppable. I mean, what else can Philly do to get back into this series when you have Toronto playing with everything working?
Well, this is the Toronto that we had seen during the regular season, and we had a hard time seeing the same thing. Now, we know, DeRozan, for Kawhi, we feel like Toronto's better. Yep. But their bench has been good. We didn't know the impact of OG, him being out with the appendectomy, yep. You know, how it would affect the team. But we still thought their bench was better. This was the first time in the series that collectively, not just one player, but several players were making contributions. That makes them an elite team in the NBA. We know where Kawhi is right now. We know the level of defense that they can play. If they're going to get back up play like this is what Milwaukee looks like with Giannis.
But there was, and that's all totally true. And to your point, Jenna, games 1 through 4, the bench total for Toronto had 42 points. Last night, they had 32 points. So that is more like what we had seen from the Raptors throughout the year. Granted, not the exact same team. They traded away DeLon Wright and C.J. Miles. OG's out with injury. Right. But they still should have some depth. But to me, this was only partially about Toronto playing great. And it was just as much about Philly not showing up. There was a play that will be forgotten to history, was forgotten in the moment. But there's a 21-point game at halftime. Philly cuts it to 13. Toronto then goes on a bit of run. It's a 16-point game midway through the third quarter. It's still a ball game. Philly calls timeout to try to stifle Toronto from going on a real run. And this is what happens coming out of that timeout. You just have the ball taken from you. Kyle Lowry just says, no, we want this. They get a foul. They get the free throws. And from that, then all of a sudden, Toronto's up by 24, and the game's over.
It's deflating.
Philly, nobody showed up for Philly. And I thought Chuck, at halftime, Charles Barkley, made a really interesting point, which is even if you don't hold Embiid's illness against him, he said when you're the star player and you are just publicly and loudly sick,
oh, my gosh, yes.
The way it deflates the energy from your team.
Yes, it puts more pressure on them.
And it saps them, he said, of their confidence.
Yes.
That even if you know you're not going to be able to play up to your level, try to hide that from as many people as possible. Not just the opponent, but your own teammates, because they didn't have the swagger that we see Philly have when Embiid is playing well, and they didn't have the swagger coming out of the gates when we didn't know Embiid was going to be able to play well. And the other element there is they do have the #1 pick of a draft, a guy that you have come to really criticize fairly. You've been on this for over a year.
Who wasn't sick, and who was fully healthy, and who easily could have walked into that spotlight last night.
And you had said that where Ben Simmons has been at his best is when Embiid is almost compromised to a degree, when they need him more. And in this series, Ben Simmons has given you 9.7 rebounds, 5 assists. He has shot 4 total free throws. Now, he's not a high free throw guy, but 4 total free throws in 5 games is ridiculous. He's not getting out and running. He's not attacking. He is not imposing his will on this series at all. And even if Simmons was great last night, they probably lose. But they don't lose by 36. They don't trail by 40 at some point. They have something to build on going into game number 6. The guys they acquired midseason showed up.
Yes.
Tobias showed up. Jimmy Butler showed up once again in this series. The guys who are part of Philly moving forward, they didn't show up in these last 2 games. That's how you go from up 2-1 to down 3-2.
The only consistent on this team has been Jimmy Butler, though. Tobias was MIA for the first couple of games. Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to get the latest from the show. Also, be sure to check out more of the best clips from First Things First, or go watch a few segments from our other shows on FS1.